11th of October, Synaxis of the Venerable Starci of the Monastery of Optina, Moses, Antony, Leonid, Marcarius, Hilarion, Ambrose, Anatolius 1, Isaac 1, Joseph, Varsanophius, Anatolius the Younger, Nectarius, Nikon the Confessor, and the Hieromata Archimandrite Isaac the Younger, shot on 26th of December 1937. Footnote: the commemoration of the Starci of Optina was instituted by the Patriarch of Moscow in July 1996. The commemoration has been approved by the Synod of the Russian Church Abroad in 1990. The monastery of Optina was returned to the church in 1987 and is now experiencing a renewal of life. End footnote. The hermitage of Optina Pustin, is situated at the edge of deep forests in the district of Kaluga, on the right bank of the river Zhizdra, some way from the town of Kozelsk, about 80 miles from Moscow. Throughout the 19th century and until the Bolshevik persecution, it was the focal point of a widespread movement of spiritual renewal, inspired by the Hesychast tradition brought to Russia by disciples of St. Paisius Velichovsky. The monastery, well known since the 16th century, had fallen into ruin as a result of the anti-monastic laws of Catherine II. Towards the end of the 18th century, Metropolitan Platon of Moscow, impressed by the beauty of its situation, gave Abbot Abraham of Pechnotsha the task of restoring the monastic buildings and of reviving Cenobitic life at Optina in the spiritual tradition promoted by St. Paisius. About 30 years later, 1821, Bishop Filaret of Kaluga, the future Metropolitan of Kiev, a fervent supporter of the Paisian ideal, undertook the building of the Skeet of the Forerunner as a dependency of the monastery for those monks who wanted to devote themselves more completely to prayer. The bishop called upon the brothers Moses and Antony Putilov to direct the life of the Skeet. They had been living in the Roslavl forests in the region of Smolensk for 10 years, under the direction of spiritual fathers from the circle of Paisius. Urged by the bishop, Moses was ordained priest and gave up his wish to devote himself to contemplation in order to take charge of the building works required. He was in Moscow seeking funds when he learnt of his nomination as abbot of the monastery, the office that he fulfilled for 37 years. Father Moses was ever in the midst of great undertakings, without resources to complete them, rich in poverty, as he liked to put it, relying solely on God's help. He directed the affairs of the monastery on the basis of the gospel precept to take no thought for the morrow, Matthew 6:34, but rather than let money mount up, he made a principle of distributing it to the poor. He would go ahead with extensive building works when food was scarce, precisely to support the local population, even if it meant the monastery going short of bread. He took no interest in the riches that some candidates for monastic life were able to offer, and he had rather receive into the community poor or sick men who were no material advantage who could be looked for. Despite his outstanding virtues and ability as a spiritual director, Father Moses confined himself to taking care for the good order of the brotherhood in external matters and left everything to do with the spiritual life to the Starci. It was due to him that the venerable fathers Leonid and Macarius came to settle at the Skeet and were able to put their charismata of discernment and insight at the service of the monks and of the people of God, thereby inaugurating the starcherstvo that would be the glory of the monastery of Optina. This prophetic ministry of spiritual direction was soon to draw large crowds and aroused fierce opposition from suspicious bishops and jealous monks who denounced the abbot to the ecclesiastical authorities as a dangerous innovator. Father Moses bore all these persecutions with ever greater humility, taking full responsibility for leaving the Staritsi in peace. He was able to say towards the end of his life, "I know now that I am the least of men." At the age of 80, suffering from dropsy and confined to his bed, he continued nevertheless to direct the life of the community in every detail. He fell asleep in peace on June 16, 1862, having received on his deathbed the great habit, longed for from his youth but foregone for the sake of serving his brethren. When Father Moses was nominated abbot, his brother Antony was put at the head of the skete. He had desired to lead the monastic life since childhood and joined Moses in the Roslavl forest after suffering many tribulations at the time of Napoleon's occupation of Moscow 1812. Firmly rooted in Hezekiah to the complete cutting off of his own will and to that humility which allows God to act in the heart of the monk, all his life long Antony considered himself to be the disciple of Moses. The often harsh manner of Moses towards him was in order to put him to the test. He always kept a respectful silence in his presence and confessed to him his every thought. He was very zealous for common prayer and would devote his free time in his cell to reading or to prayer. He cleared the ground and built the first cells of the skete with his own hands, and for 14 years watched over its spiritual and material organization. The community was constituted as a real antechamber of heaven, where the strict observance, humility, and simplicity of the monks and their deep compunction during the long services were so plainly evident that under the direction of Antony, the skete became a lodestone or magnet to spiritual men. Often ill and suffering for 30 years from suppurating sores on his legs that made him feel as though cut by a saw, Father Antony appeared always joyful nonetheless, and looked on his trials as a God-sent remedy for his salvation. He possessed his soul in patience, and when unable to leave his cell, would devote himself the more to prayer and to reading until he had the strength to get back to work. In 1859, he faced an even greater trial. Bishop Nicholas of Kaluga, who was opposed to the influence of the Staritsi, appointed him abbot of the monastery of St. Nicholas of Maloyaroslaves, that was accustomed to receive its superiors from Optina. The duty of directing a community of 12 monks who lacked unity and fervour in a monastery situated near a town became a real martyrdom for Antony. Several times he begged the bishop to relieve him of his post, but met with a firm refusal. The affairs of the monastery of Maloyaroslavets occasionally took Antony to Moscow, where he came to the notice of the Holy Metropolitan Filaret, who, sympathizing with his spiritual trial, interceded for him with the Bishop of Kaluga. Antony's resignation was only accepted after the appointment of a new bishop. Then, having installed his successor, he was able at last to return with joy to Optina and to resume his place as his brother's disciple. 1859, he spent the last 3 years of his life in a small cell in the skete with a view only of the sky, surrounded by a mountain of books and no longer concerned with administrative matters. He retained the same zeal for prayer as in his youth and would often say, "Pray fervently to the Lord God, and your cold heart will be warmed by his sweetest name, for our God is fire. Calling upon his name destroys impure thoughts and also warms our hearts to fulfill his commandments." When he served the divine liturgy, he was full of grace, especially at the moment of the great entrance. Antony lent his support to the institution of the Staritsi and to the development of their ministry, but he held back from spiritual direction himself, although warm and affable towards those who sought his help. When visitors put him put to him philosophical or theological questions, he would refer them to Father Moses or Starets Macarius, or simply reply, "Purify your heart and you will learn everything." He was greatly afflicted by the death of his brother and spiritual father Moses in 1862, and remained in seclusion for almost a year in order to re-establish in secret his spiritual communion with the departed. As increasing infirmities left him incapable of going to church, he received the great habit in his cell, and thereafter devoted himself entirely to prayer. On his cell wall he hung up an inscription in large letters that read, "Don't waste time." Reckoning that he was no more than a beginner, he added labor to labor in preparation for his meeting with God. He made all the arrangements for his burial, and having taken the blessing of Abba Isaac for his last journey, he gave up his soul to God on the 7th of August, 1865. He was buried next to his brother. The work of the Venerable Moses and Antony had created conditions favorable to the establishment of Starochestvo, which came into its own with the arrival at Optina in 1829 of Starets Leonid, who was already 60 and was to spend the remaining 12 years of his life at the skete. Father Leonid Nagolkin came of a family of modest standing from Karachev in the government of Orel. Having spent his youth as a commercial traveller, he had acquired a wide experience of mankind. He had entered Optina as a novice at the age of 29, but stayed for only 2 years and received the habit at White Bluff Hermitage, Belje Berega. Not long after, on his ordination to the priesthood, he met Starets Theodore, who, after some 30 years at Nayamps, the monastic training ground of St. Paisius in Moldavia, had returned to spread the Hesychast tradition in Russia. When Leonid became abbot of White Bluff, 1804, Theodore joined him there. At the end of 4 years, Leonid resigned, received the great habit under the name of Lev, and went with Starets Theodore and Cleopas, another hermit from the monastery of Nayamps, to devote himself to prayer in the forest. As many faithful eager for instruction were drawn to the spiritual renown of Theodore, the 3 hermits decided to flee the district. Leonid and Cleopas settled in a skete of the distant monastery of Valam, where Theodore joined them after a 3-year confinement in another monastery following a calumnious accusations. At Valam, monks were always coming to seek their counsel, for the light of their lives could no more be hidden there than before. Suspicious of their reputation, the abbot of Valam complained of them to the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg as innovators. Although cleared of that charge, the 3 hermits thought it best to leave Valam, and they settled at the monastery of St. Alexander of Svir, where 5 years later Starets Theodore entered into rest, 1822. The loss of his spiritual father was a severe trial for Leonid. He took refuge in God, who from that time gave him the gift of continual prayer and the discernment of thoughts. He wanted to retire to the skete of Optina, but the brethren would not let him go. In 1829, Starets Leonid was able at last to leave the monastery of Severe and to settle at Optina with 6 disciples. The perfection of his ascetic life, his wisdom, his gift of insight into the hidden depths of souls, as well as his kindness and compassion for sinners and for the distressed, won him the love and respect of everyone. He was tall, of tremendous physical strength, and in spite of advanced years and a malady that made him corpulent, was always completely alert. He had long yellow-grey hair like the mane of a lion, a bright, penetrating eye, and a lively, familiar way of speaking that was never without a touch of humour. Those who encountered him received an impression of undaunted strength and majestic calm that gave them a sense of peace and confidence, so that in his presence hearts opened to God, disappointments and evil thoughts vanished. People crowded into his cell, which became the spiritual center of the monastery, and each person was able to ask him the questions he wanted, while the white-clad elder sat on his bed and continued his usual manual work of plaiting belts. To some, he revealed their secret thoughts to help them change their lives. Others he healed by reading them a prayer or by anointing them with holy oil. He taught, exhorted, making himself all things to all men, without ever losing his interior recollection and prayer. Some monks, however, were scandalized at a Hesychast conversing so freely and often for so many hours with people of all sorts and conditions. Others accused him of innovation in his administration of the sacrament of confession. Father Leonid answered that the practice of revelation of thoughts and of spiritual conversation with an elder, which goes back to the origins of monastic life, does not aim at replacing the sacrament of confession, but at completing it. It is not enough to listen to an often mechanical confession of sins and to read a prayer of absolution. The conscience must also be set right and freed, and the ability to advance towards God must be restored to the person in all his uniqueness. Nevertheless, the elder's activity continued to excite jealousy and suspicion. In 1836, a denunciation accusing Abbot Moses and Starets Leonid of wanting to ruin the monastery for the benefit of the skeet was delivered to the Bishop of Kaluga by the secret police. The bishop, who had already made plain his opposition, summoned Moses and reprimanded him severely. Leonid was ordered to live at the monastery and was forbidden to wear the great habit or to receive visitors. The elder obeyed the first two injunctions but could not drive away the crowd of faithful who pressed at the door of his new cell. When the abbot, in fear, warned him that the bishop would deport him for rebelliousness, he replied, "Well, what of it? Even if you send me to Siberia, even if you make a bonfire and put me on it, I'll still be the same Leonid. I don't ask anyone to come to see me, and I can't drive away those who do come. Many, especially of the simple folk, are perishing for foolish reasons and crying for spiritual help. How can I disregard their needs?" Unable to say a word to the contrary, Abbot Moses silently withdrew. Persecution of Father Leonid extended to his disciples. He was accustomed to send those of his spiritual daughters who desired to consecrate themselves to God to take counsel of a virtuous nun called Anthea at the monastery of Bellev. The confessor of this convent took umbrage at the reputation Anthea gained from this, for she was not under his spiritual direction, and he accused the Starets of disseminating a new heresy by allowing a nun to hear confessions and to give absolution in his name. He was even labelled a Freemason for recommending nuns to read St. Dorotheos of Gaza. When the matter was brought to the attention of Bishop Damascene of Tula, of whom the convent depended, he ordered the expulsion of Anthea. As for the Starets, he was transferred to an isolated cell, and the injunction against receiving visitors was renewed. But that turned out to be a complete dead letter, for it could not prevent crowds coming to bow down at his feet to kiss the hem of his garment. He would undoubtedly have been exiled to Solovki in the far north, but for the providential intervention of the Metropolitans Philaret of Kiev and Philaret of Moscow, who had been alerted to the situation in the letter from Starets Makarios, supported by Saint Ignatius Brianchaninov. Anthea was recalled to Bellev and indeed subsequently became abbess there, while the bishops of Tula and Kaluga went to Optina together in order to reinstate Father Leonid in his charismatic ministry. The saint gave up his soul to God not long after, on the 11th of October 1841, at the age of 72, leaving as his successor Starets Makarios, his fellow labourer and close friend, who had become, as it were, his other half during the last 7 years of his life. The two men were, however, very different. Where Leonid was a man of the people with little education, jovial and down to earth, Makarios Ivanov was the scion of a pious, noble family in the district of Kaluga. He was gentle and retiring, small and weak of build, and had poor eyesight and a speech defect. His face always bore an expression of concentration that gave him a sombre look, and yet it shone with goodness as if illumined from within by a gentle light. He loved music and nature and had a wide knowledge of the theological literature. He gave up his property in the prospect of an advantageous marriage to become a novice in the remote forest hermitage of Ploszczynsk, where the emphasis in the monastic life was on rigorous external discipline. At the end of 5 years, he received the habit and was soon ordained priest, 1815. It was about that time that Starets Athanasius came to end his days at Ploszczynsk. Like Starets Theodore, he had lived at Neamptz under the direction of St. Paisius. He had assisted in his work of translating patristic texts and had brought back to Russia several manuscripts on prayer and the contemplative life. Starets Athanasius assisted Makarios to the understanding of these works and initiated him above all into the practice of inner prayer. Shortly after the repose of his elder, Makarios was appointed confessor to the convent of Svensk. He prayed to God to send him a man capable of resolving the many questions that arose in the discharge of this duty, and Starets Leonid arrived soon after to spend 6 months at Ploszczynsk before settling at Optina. Leonid perceived the remarkable qualities of Makarios and regarded the younger man as his equal, but, giving way to his entreaties, he accepted him as his disciple. After Leonid's departure, the two men, for 4 years, kept up a regular correspondence until Makarios was free to join Leonid in 1834. Starets Makarios was appointed confessor of the monastery in 1836 and became rector of the Skete 3 years later. Always considering himself to be the disciple of Starets Leonid, he never undertook anything without his blessing. He was always at his side, and for 7 years together they directed the spiritual life of the monks and of the thousands of visitors who hastened to Optina. As rector of the Skete, Starets Makarios enhanced the solemnity of the services and created a rich library. He would get up at 2 a.m., pray for about 4 hours, and then sit down at his work table to translate or revise patristic texts, or take up once again his immense correspondence, of which 5 volumes of letters showing the full extent of his wisdom were published after his death. After the meal taken with the brethren, he would allow himself a free hour in the garden that he had planted, where he would look at the different flowers, full of silent admiration at the wonderful work of the Creator. At 2 p.m., he would receive the men and women waiting for him in the guest house at the entrance of the Skete. Whatever the questions on their minds, he would listen with love and humility, and discerning what was appropriate to the situation of each, he would immediately and authoritatively say what should be done, or would give some words of consolation, so that after conversing with him, each person would go on his way renewed. His speech was always gentle, brought the proud to their knees, gave hope to the discouraged, brought unbelievers to the faith, and had the power to expel demons. A possessed man brought to him one day, when the Starets came into the room. A possessed man was brought to him one day. When the Starets came into the room, the man leapt at him with a shout, gave him a hard slap, and Makarios immediately offered the other cheek. Let's have a closer look. Saint Anthony, Moses, and Makarios. The demon, unable to withstand the elder, thereupon left the poor man, who fell at the saint's feet in a faint, and after a while stood up healed. On returning to the skeet in the evening, worn out and unable to utter another word, the starets would listen to the prayers by way of repose before seeing the brethren of the skeet for their daily confession. After supper and evening prayers, he would be engaged with his correspondence until late at night. His countenance, like that of an angel of God, was burning and full of light, wrote his disciple and biographer. His gaze was peaceable, his speech humble and unpretentious, but his spirit was ever united to God by ceaseless inner prayer, in virtue of which his face shone with spiritual joy and radiated love of neighbour. Even when he was asleep, his lips continued to repeat the Jesus prayer, and he would spend the long hours when he could not sleep meditating upon providence or chanting the hymns of the church with tears. Although he himself had received the grace of inner prayer, the starets was well aware of the dangers of spiritual delusion. In his letters, he warns his disciples against seeking the gifts of grace prematurely, and insists above all on humility that we acquire by trying to put the commandments of God into practice as perfectly as we can. Starets Macarius embarked upon the publication of a series of patristic texts on the spiritual life, urged by his friend and spiritual son, the Slavophile philosopher Ivan Kirievsky, who found at Optina and in the Orthodox tradition the essence of the Slav soul, beginning with the publication of a life of Starets Paisius in 1846. Translations followed of texts of the Holy Fathers, including Dorotheus of Gaza, Varasanofios and John, Mark the Ascetic, Isaias, Maximus the Confessor, Thalassius, John Climacus, Theodore the Studite, Simeon the New Theologian, Isaac the Syrian, and Nilos of Sora. In most cases, Macarius and his team of learned disciples, that included Starets Ambrose, revised the Slavonic translations made at Neamptz at the time of St. Paisius and put them into Russian. These editions were widely read and made Optina known all over Russia to the intellectual elite, whose greatest names found their way to the monastery, among them Nicholas Gogol, Vladimir Soloviev, Konstantin Leontiev, Dostoevsky, and even Tolstoy. The renown of Optina was profitable to the whole church, but it gave rise to renewed persecution. Attempts to discredit the starets were made on the flimsiest grounds. For instance, he was blamed for spreading knowledge about the Jesus prayer among the people, because it might give rise to spiritual delusions. Talk of transferring him to another monastery came to nothing, thanks to the influence of his friends with the Metropolitan Philadet of Moscow. From 1850, the health of the starets gradually grew worse, although in his compassion for the sufferings of mankind he ignored his own afflictions. He took an interest in the great cultural, social, and political changes taking place in Russia. On hearing of the fall of Sevastopol during the Crimean War, he went down on his knees in tears before the icon of the Mother of God. During his last illness, he continued to receive visitors to whom he would give a small cross, an icon, or a book as a blessing. He fell asleep in peace on the 7th of September 1860, and his body subsequently remained incorrupt. After the repose of Starets Macarius, the ministry of spiritual direction passed to Starets Ilarion, the rector of the Skeet, and to Starets Ambrose. St. Ambrose incorporated all the charismata of his predecessors and brought Starochestvo to its height at Optina, where for 30 years he was a true prophet for the whole Russian people. Father Ilarion Ponomarov had been a tailor in his youth. Soon after he entered Optina, he was placed in the service of Starets Macarius, who had recently been appointed rector of the Skeet, 1839. He remained in his service until the death of the Stares and was able to make great progress in the science of the spirit, both by following his manner of life and by frequent conversations with him or with Father Leonid. Observing Ilarion's progress, Father Macarius gradually preferred him to be his successor by sending some of his spiritual children to him, as well as to Father Ambrose. Ilarion afterwards became rector of the skete and confessor of the monastery. After taking confessions all day, he would receive the monks in the evening and give them his counsels. He never spoke in his own name, but would always quote the Holy Fathers, or what Father Macarius had said in similar circumstances. His words of instruction were clear, concise, and based on his own experience of the battle with passionate thoughts. He was always approachable and received all his visitors with the same attention and courtesy, whatever their rank in society. When he observed that people who sought his help had need of confession, he would give them a space of 3 days to examine their consciences and make known the cause of their maladies. Thus he put numerous sinners on the path of godliness and cured many who were mentally sick by his prayer. Despite the serious illness that afflicted him in the last 2 years of his life, he did not cease from his labors, but only begged God to grant him patience. He persisted in following his prayer rule in his cell, like the other monks at the skete, to the very end of his life. He fell asleep in peace on the 18th of September 1873. On the death of Stareț Ambrose in 1891, his faithful and humble disciple Joseph Litovkin took over as spiritual father. When he entered Optina in 1861, 1 year before the repose of Abbot Moses, he had been appointed to serve Father Ambrose, who on their first encounter predicted that the young man would be a help to everyone. He served the Stareț with exemplary obedience and humility for 50 years. For more than 20 years he did not even have a cell of his own, but had to stand about until the elder's waiting room cleared of visitors in the late evening before he could take any rest. He was ordained priest when the monastery of Shamordino was consecrated in 1884 and would sometimes serve there, although he continued for the most part to attend on Father Ambrose, whom frequent illness prevented from going to church. He was always calm, silent, and discreet, and his deep humility was evident before he had spoken a word. The crowds who pressed in to visit the Stareț completely trusted Joseph, seeing in him the very image of the elder. When Ambrose began sending some visitors to take counsel of Joseph, they observed with amazement that both fathers gave exactly the same advice. Father Joseph fell gravely ill in 1888 and received the great habit, but he recovered through the prayer of Stareț Ambrose and a vision of the Mother of God. After Father Joseph's formal designation as confessor, he received those who came to visit Stareț Ambrose. Every year he used to spend a month with the elder at Shamordino. In 1890, when Father Ambrose told him to return alone to Optina, Joseph said not a word against it, although greatly distressed at the separation. From then on, the monks of the monastery and skete, and even the venerable Abbot Isaac, began coming to confess to Father Joseph, and Father Ambrose sent his spiritual children to him, both monastic and lay, from Shamordino. Regarding himself as a complete nullity without his elder, Joseph made the spirit of Ambrose so much his own that he acted in every respect like the Stareț, while losing nothing of his own personality. While Father Ambrose was highly educated and willing to discuss matters of public interest with visitors, Stareț Joseph preferred to remain silent. When a visitor expounded his problems, he would look at him full of kindness. Then, with an angelic smile, he would answer him in short, profound sentences inspired by the teaching of the Holy Fathers in order to straighten out his confusion and warm his heart. Above all, he laid stress on obedience and self-contempt, as the roots of humility by which we can attain impassibility and attract God to come to dwell within us. Although harsh towards himself, he was full of consideration for others while avoiding familiarity. He would reply to the questions of all kinds, but would never open a discussion himself. Starets Anatolios Zertsalov entered Optina following a miraculous recovery from tuberculosis. Starets Macarius, who received him, initiated him into the practice of the Jesus prayer and sent him at times to Father Ambrose or Father Joseph. Guided by the holy elders, Father Anatolius made such progress in the spiritual life that St. Ignatius Brianchaninov, who visited the Skeet one day, acknowledged that he had been greatly edified by a conversation with him. For all his devotion to the Starci, Anatolius endured tribulations from monks opposed to Starchestvo, and he used these trials as a means of continuing steadfast in patience and humility. After the death of Starets Macarius, 1860, he drew close to Father Ambrose, who often sent him as a fellow labourer to the guest house to give a word of consolation to afflicted souls. Soon after his ordination as priest, 1870, Anatolius refused the abbacy of the monastery of St. Saviour at Orlov for the sake of remaining with St. Ambrose. As rector of the Skeet from 1875 and confessor of the monks of the monastery, Father Anatolius's care for each one of the brethren was plain to see. His cell was next to that of Ambrose at the entrance of the Skeet, and most pilgrims went on to see him after visiting Starets Ambrose. Father Anatolius took counsel of Starets Ambrose on every matter, and each time he came to see him, he would humbly go down on his knees like the other visitors. His humility was so great that he fell ill one day when told that St. John of Kronstadt had seen him in a vision serving the liturgy with the angels. Father Anatolius became the closest helper of the Starets at the time of the foundation of Shamordino and served the convent for 21 years, instructing the sisters in the Jesus prayer and in monastic discipline. Toward the end of his life, he acquired the same power of discernment of thoughts as Macarius and Ambrose, and he would often utter prophecies about the future of his spiritual children. After the death of St. Ambrose, the Bishop of Kaluga forbade Father Anatolius to visit Shamordino. This new trial in his old age undermined his health, but having to travel to Moscow, he found the strength to go on pilgrimage to Kronstadt, where he served the Divine Liturgy with St. John. On his return to Optina, Starets Anatolius received the great habit in secret, and enduring his sufferings with patience to the end, he fell asleep on the 25th of January 1894, a few months before Archimandrite Isaac, the abbot of the monastery. Upon the passing of Starets Anatolius, Father Joseph was unanimously chosen to succeed him as confessor and as rector of the Skeet. He ordered the affairs of the community less by virtue of his authority than by paternal love and humility, before which all self-will gave way. But for all that, he insisted on strict observance of the principles of monastic life, and the monks would not undertake work of any kind without first taking his blessing. For 12 years, he also took care of the spiritual direction of the nuns at Shamordino and of the crowds of lay people who visited the monastery. However, frequent bouts of illness obliged him to resign as rector of the Skeet in 1906, and he no longer heard confessions, but could not shut his door on the many who still came to ask his blessing and the support of his prayer. The death of the abbess of Shamordino in 1911 and his own rapidly failing health presented the prospect of difficult days ahead for the convent founded by St. Ambrose, which meant so much to Father Joseph. Suffering from malarial fever and confined to his bed, Starets Joseph asked that all the monks of Optina then all the nuns of Shamordino and from the monastery of Bellev should come to his cell to take his blessing. So for some days endless queues of weeping monks and nuns could be seen making their way to the starets's cell. Having blessed all his spiritual children, he entered deeply into prayer and gave up his soul to God on the 8th of May 1911. He was 74 years old. Father Isaac Antimonov, who came of a line of rich Kursk merchants, entered the skete of Optina in 1841, at about the same time as Father Ambrose. He was ordained to the priesthood, notwithstanding his reluctance, and recommended to the Holy Metropolitan Filaret of Moscow by Starets Macarius to succeed Father Moses as abbot of the main monastery in 1862. With great faith and obedience to divine providence, Father Isaac forsook his beloved Ezekiel to spend over 30 years occupied with extensive and much-needed building works and with restoring the monastery's economic stability, which Father Moses had neglected. He relied on the discernment of Starets Ambrose and asked his advice on every matter of importance. For all his great responsibilities, he remained humble and simple with his brethren. On Saturdays, when he went for confession to Father Ambrose, he would wait his turn with the other visitors. He hesitated for a while before backing the foundation of Shamordino. When Starets Ambrose went to live there permanently, he did not disguise his disappointment. Even so, he resolutely took up the cause of the convent when the bishop wanted to sever its connection with the monastery of Optina. The withdrawal of Father Ambrose marked the beginning of a time of trials for the monastery. Father Isaac himself was stricken by paralysis and only recovered some strength during the last year of his abbacy. In the end, he fell asleep with dysentery and gave up his soul to God with deep prayer on the 28th of August, 1894, at the age of 85. Starets Varsanofius Plekhantkov came of a wealthy Cossack family and had been a colonel in the staff corps of the Kazan district. He fell ill and at death's door was told in a vision to go to Optina. As soon as he recovered, he went to see Starets Ambrose, who advised him to put his affairs in order and to come back in 3 months. Having overcome with difficulty all the obstacles in his way, he arrived at the monastery on the very day of the saint's burial, October 1891. Father Anatolius placed him under the direction of Starets Nectarios, who conveyed to him the spiritual inheritance of the preceding fathers. He was ordained a priest-monk and served as a military chaplain during the Russo-Japanese War, 1905. On returning to Optina after the war, he found the skete in decline. Starets Joseph was too old and infirm to direct affairs, and the community was in a perilous condition both materially and spiritually. Father Varsanofius was then appointed rector and put matters to rights with energy and wisdom. Strict in his ascesis and not a man to make allowances for the spirit of the times, he combined high expectations of his monks with compassionate understanding. As he instructed them in the traditional path of evangelic perfection, he would enliven his discourse with numerous illustrations or comparisons drawn from music, which he had greatly appreciated. Like his predecessors, he stressed the importance of humility, revelation of thoughts, and of the unceasing Jesus prayer. He said that this prayer is like a boundless ocean which those who persevere in monastic discipline cross without the cares and concerns of this world in order to reach the kingdom. While it is fitting, he said, to ask God to grant us prayer without distractions, we ought to leave the high degrees of contemplative prayer to the free outpouring of his grace. He possessed the charism of prevision that often appeared during confession, as well as the gifts of healing and prophecy. Unsparing of himself, he fell ill in 1910 and received the great habit. he recovered only to meet with a great trial. Among the 300 brethren of the monastery there was a group influenced by secular attitudes and without understanding of starchestvo, who aimed at the closure of the skete through unremitting criticism of Father Varsanofius. Their opposition turned into a real conspiracy that led to an episcopal visitation and the removal of Father Varsanofius, who was appointed abbot of the distant monastery of Golotvinsky. In spite of age and ill health, he restored the monastic buildings there within a year and revived the community with the spirit of the Starosti of Optina. In all his trials, he followed after Christ in his passion. Exhausted by his labors and ill with cancer, he would refuse the proffered remedies and exclaim, "Let me be, I am on the cross." When illness incapacitated him, he wrote to the Holy Synod offering his resignation and asking permission to return to Optina to leave my bones there. He gave up his soul to God on the 1st of April 1913 before he could receive an answer and was buried at Optina among the other starci. Father Nectarios Tikhonov, the last starets of Optina, was born into a poor family in 1857. He worked for a merchant who wanted him as a son-in-law, but on the advice of an aged nun, he made his way to Optina to take counsel of the starci. As soon as Starets Ambrose set eyes on him, he turned aside from his other visitors and spoke to him for 2 hours. He remained under the spiritual direction of Father Anatolius, the rector of the skete, for more than 20 years, but also frequently consulted Father Ambrose and thus learnt the principles of spiritual direction. Well grounded in the doctrine of the Holy Fathers, he took a lively interest in literary, artistic, and scientific questions, and was always able to point to their spiritual implications. Soon after his ordination to the priesthood, 1898, he wanted to set out on a distant mission, but Father Joseph would not give his blessing, so he stayed at the skete, which enabled him to devote himself to the contemplative life. At another stage in his life, he attempted to follow the road of foolishness for Christ, until the senior fathers of the skete put a stop to his eccentricities. In the end, he found that semi-reclusion suited him best. He liked to say that there are only 2 reasons for a monk to leave his cell: to go to church and to be taken to the grave. But he remained interested in cultural life, and his visitors included eminent figures in the literary and artistic world. His advice to intellectuals was, stop thinking, because thoughts fly everywhere. Begin to draw within yourself and to contemplate. He said that artists claim in vain to be creators, since they do no more than rearrange words, images, and things made by God by means of the spirit that he had given them, while there is another art, incomparably higher, that consists in transforming oneself. In 1913, the monks of Optina met to choose a new stares, Archimandrite Agapitos, who had withdrawn to Optina with some disciples and led a godly life. Refused the nomination and pointed to Nectarios, who had to accept out of obedience. He settled in Father Ambrose's cell at the entrance of the skete and began to exercise his ministry of spiritual direction with Father Anatolius the Younger, Potapov, as his fellow worker. He regarded himself as the poorest and weakest of everyone, but relied upon the grace of God and the faith of those who came to him for a word of instruction. He joined great simplicity of character with a penetrating spirit, and he inherited the ability of his predecessors to read the secrets of hearts and to adapt his words to the needs of each person. Stricter and more austere in his teaching than Starets Anatolius, he was exacting towards clergy and members of the intelligentsia, but approachable and full of kindness for simple people. He was especially solicitous for hardened sinners, whom he would tenderly address as "my precious child" or "my little lamb." He possessed a fine sense of humour and would often illustrate his anecdotes from the history of the Skeet, of which he was one of the oldest inhabitants. Above all, he laid stress upon obedience, whereby we imitate Christ, who, through obedience, became man for our salvation, and upon prayer, whereby the grace-deprived soul returns to life. After the outbreak of the revolution, he took a stand with the Holy Patriarch Tikhon against the so-called living church and forbade his spiritual children to have anything to do with those who were prepared to betray the church to the communists. The monastery of Optina was closed in 1923 and vandalized by activists in 1926. Starets Nectarius was exiled to the village of Holmiska in the district of Bryansk, where he fell asleep in the Lord at an advanced age on the 29th of May, 1928. About 7 years later, his body was found to be incorrupt. The teaching of Starets Varsanophios was set down in writing by his disciple, Starets Nikon Belayev. He had received an exceptional Christian education under the guidance of his mother, a spiritual daughter of St. John of Kronstadt, and arrived at Optina with his brother in 1907 when he was 19. On the advice of Metropolitan Trifon, who greatly admired Father Varsanophios, Nikon unhesitatingly put himself under the spiritual direction of the Starets, in spite of the objections of some of the monks. He put all his energy into absorbing the teaching of St. Varsanophios, whose secretary he became. The elder perceived a deep sense of the spiritual in the cheerful young monk, and after a teaching session adapted to the needs of all, would often take him aside to deliver the fruit of his experience and to exhort him prophetically to lay up a store of patience against the trials that he would have to endure when he was in his place. Nikon received the habit in 1909, and upon the exile of Starets Varsanophios was transferred from the Skeet to the monastery, where he was given the obedience of secretary. He was ordained priest in April 1917 and, amid the torment of revolution, skillfully reorganized the monastery, deprived of its income by the Bolsheviks, as an agricultural legion. He was arrested for no apparent reason in September 1919, imprisoned at Kozelsk, and released after a short time. Ready to die rather than abandon the monastery, he stayed at his post, expecting expulsion, exile, and torture at any moment. In 1923, the Bolsheviks ordered monastic services to cease at Optina, and most of the community was scattered, although Father Nikon was able to remain for some time, serving at the main church. He acted as spiritual father for the pilgrims who continued to come, and also directed a group of nuns from Shamordino who had taken refuge at Kozelsk. Early in 1924, the last church at the monastery was closed. Nikon, however, continued to serve the Divine Liturgy and to receive visitors in his cell until the 15th of June. Obliged at last to leave Optina, he settled temporarily near the Cathedral of Kozelsk. Full of faith and confidence in Providence, he gave courage to the people, and a growing number of spiritual children gathered around him, often sent by Starets Nectarios, by Archimandrite Isaac the Younger, or by Fathers Meletios and Dositheos. He gave the utmost of his strength and time to all the souls entrusted to him, providing material assistance to the most needy, and he spent many hours over his correspondence. He would receive the monks exiled from Optina in the mornings and those who had come to see him from afar afield. He devoted the rest of his time to confessing his other spiritual children with the same gifted discernment as the elders in times past. Once a week he would visit the community of nuns. However, this situation only lasted for 3 years. In June 1927, Father Nikon was arrested with 2 other members of the clergy His spiritual children did all they could to support him in prison by sending parcels. They also wrote to him and he replied, sustaining their faith and assuaging their grief. In January 1928, he was sentenced to 3 years' exile in the concentration camp of Solovki, but the course of events took him to other places. Being exempt from manual work because of a bad leg, he found time for prayer, and thanks to the help sent by his spiritual children, he was able to survive the dreadful conditions of detention prior to his transfer to the Popov Islands of Karelia. Soon after he was exiled to Archangel with his companion, Father Agapitos, in spite of being in an advanced stage of tuberculosis. He was then transferred to Penega and assigned as a general hand to a cruel and implacable woman who drove him out when he was no longer able to work. He was taken care of by a monk of Optina, an exile like himself, and gave up his soul on the 25th of June 1931, aged 43, as he traced the sign of the cross in the ear to bless his spiritual children from afar. Through the prayers of your saints, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on us. Amen.